If you don't read the newspaper, you're uninformed. If you do read it, you're misinformed. What is the long-term effect of too much information?
Information, I just need some information. I've been dying. Is it lack of education? I've been reading without any transformation. I'm addicted. Is it overstimulation? Hey.
Welcome to the Sixth Sense Report.
Hear ye, come one, come all. You are listening to the Sixth Sense Report with Joel Nikoloff and Darnell Samuels.
Bro, man, I just feel more and more blessed every time you have a guest on.
You always say that.
I know, but it's so true. I know it's like my go-to line. I feel blessed, but like, you know, when people are willing to come onto your show and you know, have a conversation with you, you know, it's a blessing.
Yes. So for our listeners, today we have a special guest, Arnold Viersen, Albertan. Is that how you guys say it? Albertan, welcome.
Yep. Yeah, that's right.
All right. So for our listeners who aren't familiar with you, can you give them a background on yourself?
Well, yeah, thanks, Darnell and Joel, for inviting me on here. I'm a member of Parliament for Peace River Westlock, or as I like to call it, the Promised Land. It's a big chunk of northern Alberta. We are the honey capital of Canada. We got 7,500 dairy animals, so we're literally flowing with milk and honey. I'm
is that what you call it, the Promised Land?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, that's so good.
Yeah, no, well, it gets better than that. We're also, I represent the municipal districts of Peace and Opportunity, and it's all been settled on a promise called Treaty Number 8. So it's quite literally the Promised Land in more ways than one. But yeah, I'm an auto mechanic by trade, so a bit of an odd duck when it comes to members of Parliament. I don't think there's any other members of Parliament who are auto mechanics, and my friends always say, Arnold, there's not a wrench big enough to fix Ottawa. I always say, well, we gotta try one way or the other, right? So I got elected in 2015, so I've survived 2 elections so far.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. And married, got 4 children and 1 more on the way. 2 girls, 2 boys, and keeps life busy and entertaining. There's no doubt about that, and keeps things in perspective for sure. So.
Right. What made you want to get into politics?
Well, I just got mad one day, I guess, is the story of it. I wasn't really involved in politics a whole bunch, but coming from Alberta, I particularly around pipeline politics, that really motivated me. The fact that the rest of the country seemed happy to take all of the money that Alberta produced, but not so interested in allowing Alberta to continue to produce that money. So that was one thing. The other thing was I'm a pro-life guy, and I was just frustrated with how the government seemed to lack any interest in that area. And then firearms issues and firearms rights as well were like big on my priority list. So that's what got me engaged in politics. And then where I live was a brand new riding in 2013. And so in 2015 was the first election for that area. And so I'm the first MP for that area. So that was just an opportunity. It was probably the biggest thing. I thought, well, you know what? There's no incumbent, nobody to beat to get the spot, essentially. So I put my name in. So that's how I got involved. It's not the noblest of ideas, I guess, but you got mad and got involved. I think that's what happens for a lot of people. But
I think it's commendable that, because a lot of times people are gonna complain and mope and complain, but you actually did something. You actually you guys just threw your wrench away and said, "Look, man, I need to fix this." So it's also it says a lot about you as a person, but also I read your bio that you're a man of faith, and I was wondering how you incorporate that into what role does that play in you being a politician?
Yeah, I guess it's I get asked that question a lot. I guess it 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 plays a role and it doesn't play a role. Like it just is a thing. Um, it's my faith is motivates me for everything that I do, and including the way that I do politics and the policies that I pursue and all this kind of stuff. So, um, I yeah, this I guess to some degree the challenge that we face here in Canada is the secularists have effectively convinced the church that the politics and religion don't mix. And yet, the irony is that they don't leave their worldview at the door.
Mm-hmm.
Um, One of my favorite theologians always says it's not a matter of whether, but which, right? It's not a matter of whether religion plays a role in politics. It's just a matter of which religion's playing a role in politics.
Yes, nice. No,
Yeah,
totally.
we did an episode way back. I think it was like 35 called Church and State. And I always make the comment, it's sort of the American doctrine, but the doctrine was that the state was supposed to stay out of the church. And somehow it's been flipped that the church is supposed to stay out of the state.
Yeah. Yeah, it's totally that's the like the separation of church and state in like it's a fairly American idea. Was very much that Congress, so like the national government, wouldn't impose a national state church upon the individual states. Because the irony is that when that document was written, I think 9 out of the 13 states had a state recognized church. So
Yeah.
it's fascinating. But,
Yeah, no, it's but on one of our episodes we made the distinction that there can be overlap with religion and politics, but not church and state, and that there's a difference between the entities, the institutions of the church and the state, and then when it comes to ideologies, religion and politics, sometimes there is overlap. Not just Christian religion, but religion in general and ideologies. There's overlap. So.
mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. But that's not a distinction. That's a distinction that we make on our side of the argument,
Yes.
but that's
Yes.
not a distinction that's made on the other side. The folks that I get to deal with that are telling me to leave my religion out of it, or there's a separation of church and state, they're basically just telling me that my opinion doesn't matter and I should leave it at home, kind of thing. So I push back on that regularly, but.
Good call. And I mean, it sounds like it's a tactic to win the argument, not to actually to avoid addressing your position, as opposed to actually, wrestling with the arguments you're trying to make, I'm guessing.
Yeah. It's very much a tactic. Yeah.
Yeah. So we did an episode 105, porn and poutine, and we discussed about the Pornhub parent company MindGeek, and the New York Times article that was done on them and exposing the child pornography, the rape videos, and so forth. But the thing that stuck out about that report to Joel and I was that MindGeek is in Montreal. And sometimes we look at Americans, they're like, everything terrible comes out of there. But then we saw, I was like, whoa, this is in our backyard. This business is in our backyard. And so we were looking at MasterCard, of course, and Visa restricting its use on those sites. But we wanted to look at stopping MindGeek and pornography and child sex trafficking and child pornography on our side of the border, and looking at practical solutions that we could do legally to stop them. And so, yeah, and that's why we wanted to sit down and talk with you about that. So, but what has been your take so far on the whole investigation on MindGeek?
Yeah, so this goes back a long time for me. Back when I got elected, I got chose number 37 on the private members business list. And so at the beginning of every parliament after election, they basically put everyone's name in a hat, then they pull them out, and that gives us an order as to who gets to go on the private members bill. So I got chose number 37 back in 2015. And I put a motion on the order paper calling for the government of Canada to do a study on the impacts of pornography on Canadian society way back then. When I did that, I didn't have a clue about this company called Pornhub or MindGeek, but fairly quickly discovered that Canada has the luxury of being the host of the largest porn company in the world in Pornhub. So it's a major player in this industry, I suppose you could say. The Americans actually, the reason this is not an American company is because the American law is actually better. So the American law requires that a company like Pornhub maintain records of the age and identification of all of the folks that appear in their videos. And so because of that requirement, they didn't set up in the United States, they set up in Canada. So that is one of the things that we're working on, is ensuring that anybody that appears online in a video of one of these adult sites, their age and consent be verified in some fashion.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say, with what they did with purging all of the content, would that, assuming we pass that law, would it likely be that they're sort of currently in compliance, or?
Yeah, not really, because they still have like their verified content. They call it verified, but that still is that just means that they recognize these particular uploaders as partners, which is they've got a revenue sharing agreement.
So they would know. That means they would know who the uploader is, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have the other terms as you laid out with regards to consent.
Yeah. So, but yeah, that motion back in I put it on the order paper back in 2016. It passed the House of Commons unanimously in 2017. So interesting to note that pornography hadn't been studied by the federal government since 1985. Well, in 1985, the internet didn't exist, and I wasn't even born. So that study took place, and that kind of started the trajectory to where we are today. Basically, I came to the awareness of this company called Pornhub, and that Canada was actually a big blight on the international landscape, because this company Pornhub was operating here in Canada and with relative impunity. In Canada, we have pretty good laws around obscenity laws, and also child pornography laws, and also providing access to pornography. So if you give a minor pornography, that's a criminal code offense, right? But all three of these areas of the law didn't seem to be enforced at all online, right? Like when it came to your corner store and selling Playboy magazine, that seemed to be all three of those areas seemed to be well regulated. But when it came to the internet and the porn company Pornhub or MindGeek, all three of those laws just seem to be ignored entirely. So that's so starting in 2017, we started beating the drum to say hey, this is the laws of the country, they're not being followed. Is there a reason why this is not being prosecuted? Do we need to change the law? Here's an example of some of the titles of videos that are up on Pornhub. Is this not illegal activity? So we started bringing that to the attention of the Canadian government, and in this Parliament alone, in March of 2017, or 2020, March of 2020, 6 members of Parliament, including myself, we signed a letter to the Prime Minister saying hey, here's an example of a bunch of egregious videos that are up on Pornhub. Seems to us that they're breaking the law in several different directions. Please respond. We got no response back then. And then in November of 2020, we sent another letter signed by 20 members of Parliament to the Justice Minister, basically outlining the same thing again, saying hey, this is overtly racist overtly sexist, overtly child pornography. This is like this isn't the depiction of rape. This is like an actual rape video. Surely there's something to do. You can do something about this. And if you can't, like, please tell us where the law needs to be changed, and let's get on it. That letter sparked a New York Times report, an article in the New York Times called "The Children of Pornhub."
Okay, that's the one we read.
Yeah, so that basically, it seemed like we were beating our heads against the wall up until that article came out, and then all of a sudden the ground shifted dramatically, and suddenly the Prime Minister is being asked about this at his morning press conferences, and like 3 committees at the House of Commons was suddenly like had to study this, and the ground really moved really very quickly. So yeah, it was it's been crazy to watch how quickly
things change.
Things can move when you get the public on your side. Yeah, and so that's what then MasterCard and Visa both did like an investigation, and in 3 days they concluded that there was likely illegal activity happening on Pornhub, and so they ended their relationship with Pornhub. Kudos to PayPal. PayPal actually a year earlier had already ended their relationship with Pornhub. And so because we had been there's the National Center to End Sexual Exploitation of the United States. They'd already been harassing PayPal and MasterCard and Visa for years to end their relationship with Pornhub. But yeah, the New York Times article and the public scrutiny did that. And then MindGeek or Pornhub pulled down 80% of their content from the site.
Yes, actually, we read that.
If that's not an admission of guilt, I don't know what is.
Right. Yes.
Like they spent all this time saying, "Oh, there was nothing wrong here. There's nothing to see here. It's all above board. We're all legal. Like we don't want illegal content on our site." And then when the scrutiny like appears, they're like, yeah, we're gonna check this out again, right?" Like,
yeah, I was gonna say when their business model gets disrupted and they can't, make money.
Yeah.
Time for some change, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So where's the case right now in regards to the shakeup, in regards to us paying attention to MindGeek and pornography? But where is it right now in the country?
Well, yeah. So like, I think it's been good to have this exposed. It just allows everybody to just take a moment and reflect on where we are at as a country. There currently is a study going on at the ethics committee, and so that's, if you've seen any of the testimony, that's where that's happening, and that study isn't complete yet. So that study will, like, they're doing an investigation as to like what has Pornhub been participating in. Is the story that Pornhub is telling us, is that like real? And that committee will make recommendations to the government as to, hey, here's some directions that you should go. Here's some laws that you should change. Here's some things that Pornhub should be held accountable by. So that's ongoing. That doesn't mean that like the war on porn is kind of epitomized by that like struggle that we're having with as a country with what do we do with Pornhub. But in I guess greater terms or broader terms, we still need to just look at what are the impacts of pornography on Canadian society. And so things that we do know is 85% of the population is consuming porn on a weekly basis, right? If we, I always say, if pornography is to human trafficking what cigarettes are to cancer. And if we think about it in those terms, back in the 60s, nearly 70% of the population was smoking cigarettes. And we just didn't know that that was bad for you. We had no idea that it was harm. It was cool. It was the thing everybody was doing. There was no, like, nobody thought that you got cancer from cigarettes. Today, only 13% of the population is consuming cigarettes. And they do so knowing that they're likely giving themselves cancer. right? And we need to work on pornography in kind of those terms, right? Like, think about the fact that we've got a large percentage of the population consuming it. They have no idea that it's harmful and that they are contributing to the exploitation of women and girls around the world, and that they should stop doing that so that they aren't exploiting women and girls around the world. Once we get that conversation happening, we can reduce the usage percentage and hopefully make Canada not have the largest porn company in the world.
So a lot of what you're saying, I was listening to your speech on Motion 47, which was the online sexual violence motion, which was unanimously adopted. I think you might have referenced it when you were talking.
Yeah.
You said something in there that resonates with what you just said now, which was, or you didn't quite say it, but in that video you had mentioned, you're speaking about, so much of the content being degrading, and not just, maybe what we would think of with regards to, nude images. And then you spoke about, adolescents at 12 years old, this being, the means that they're becoming sexually educated. And what I find peculiar is like that motion was unanimously adopted. Things started moving forward. But nothing seems to have come of it. Right. So maybe can you speak to that a little bit and also maybe, unpack some of what you learned even more about sort of the influence it's having on our youth and their perceptions of sex.
So going right back to M47, Motion 47, that was my private member's motion back 2016, 2017. The motivation for that really came out of the Rehtaeh Parsons story. I don't know if you remember Rehtaeh Parsons. She was a 17-year-old girl, committed suicide in 2013, but back in 2011, when she was only 14 years old, she was at a party and she was raped at that party. And a number of boys participated and videotaped the entire thing and put it up on their Facebook page. And so that always haunted me a little bit. It was like that was the motivation. Like, why did these guys think that this was so normal? Like they obviously didn't think that this was illegal, what they were doing. They thought this was normal activity. And what made them think that this was so normal that they would brag about it, they would post it on their own social media, right? That those videos went around Rehtaeh's school. Like she changed schools 3 times, and that the videos continued to follow her. And that's eventually what led to her suicide. But the striking thing, or like the haunting thing, was like these guys that posted that, they didn't, their conscience didn't accuse them. They just thought that this was normal. And so it was that question of why did these guys think this was normal? That's how I came to realize that it's the online content that they're watching that normalizes this. I always find it fascinating. We have great discussions in this country around advertising and the ad standards and what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do and what you can market to children and what you can't market to children. And for some reason we have extensive amounts of regulations about the 30-second ad that you see before a video, but no consideration at all to what the like 30 or the 3-minute video that comes right after that ad has to say, right? And we are participating in the largest social experiment of mankind, more than likely since 2007, and the internet tube sites, or the porn tube sites, widely accessible video porn, and what kind of effect that's having. I think the Rehtaeh Parsons case is an example of what kind of effect it is having, but that's an extreme case for sure.
Wow. Yeah, when you were discussing it in that video, it's definitely haunting in terms of, the fact, as you said, that they perceived this as okay or normal. I don't even, a level of speechless. right?
Yep. Yeah. No, it's yeah, and so it's how to deal with that. That's going to be going forward. That is a number of the things. So we're looking at so meaningful age verification. So on the front side, I try to like split it into the two sides of the screen. So on the front side of the screen, just keeping kids from accessing it, right? So meaningful age verification. Pornhub brags extensively how they're the best technology company in the world. They use all the cutting edge technology, and they have all this abilities to scrutinize who's looking at their stuff. So surely, if they're the best, they should be able to keep kids off their site, right? In terms of like kids looking at their site. So we're looking for meaningful age verification legislation. It already is in the criminal code that you may not provide graphic images or explicit images to children. That's illegal in Canada, but there doesn't seem to be any enforcement of that. So I'm calling on the government to work to ensure that that is indeed happening. The other thing is staying on this side of the screen is we look to the UK. They've kind of been leaders on this. It's called opt-in legislation, and I think the state of Utah just last week actually passed a law in this regard as well. Just that if you buy a device, there's many settings features that would prevent pornography from showing up on your device, but they're often switched off. And so the Utah and the UK have it. If you buy a device, those settings are switched on when you buy the device. And if you want pornography to be available on your phone you have to go in and manually turn them off, essentially. So it's just basically reversing the onus from being on to being off. And so that's the like opt-in legislation. You have to opt in to get it. And so that's the front side of the screen. Those are like kind of the two big initiatives that I would like to see on that side of the screen. And then on the back side of the screen, just meaningful, like more age and consent verification, much like the United States has. The United States has it really only on age, but I think given where we are in history now, like they passed those laws back in the 60s, I think, was just like a photocopy of the person's ID to ensure that they are of age, they're over 18. But today we should be able to ask for age and consent, because we know that many of the people that appear in pornography and explicit videos, they haven't necessarily consented to being in the video, right. Even though it may look like they do in the moment. Years later, when they escaped their trafficker, they say, "Hey, yeah, not only was I being trafficked into prostitution, I was also being filmed, and my trafficker was making money off of me on Pornhub as well." And so we want these companies to ensure that A, the people being portrayed are over the age of 18, and B, that they're consenting to having their image posted on their site.
Yeah, and I just want to say, like, I'm guessing there's an aspect, if someone was, being critical, they would say, well, you can get, if you have kidnapped someone, let's say from a human trafficking perspective, chances are you could get them to sign. But if I was, although they can sort of make that claim, adding these barriers to entry will ideally reduce the number, even though some people may be able to get around them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the other part of it just is around like ongoing consent, right? Because that's been a big challenge around. Folks have said, "Hey, that's me in that video. Can you take it down?" Right? And it's like, "Yeah, but you don't own that video." Right? They're like, "Yeah, but it's me." Right? And that's like, so while we'd like to prevent it from getting up in the first place, we also want to ensure that it can come down when the person wants their image to come down.
Mm-hmm. Now, I noticed on your site you were talking about ways to fight the porn industry, and you talked about how do we update the criminal code of Canada to reflect the Palermo Protocol? Palermo Protocol. So what is a Palermo Protocol?
So that's a UN 5-point identification. So that's more around the human trafficking. So the UN has put in place, I can't remember right off the top of my head all the 5 points. I know that in Canada we are just lacking on one of the points. So basically, the Palermo Protocol is a template for which you can use so that an objective person can see if somebody's being trafficked or not, right? So one of the challenges that we have in Canada is that if we suspect somebody of being trafficked, whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking, we have to get that person to say, yes, I'm being trafficked, in order for us to be able to prosecute that person or their trafficker, right? The Palermo Protocol, what it does is it sets forward a series of 5 criteria that if all 5 of those criteria are met, whether the person themselves thinks that they're being trafficked or not, we can charge their trafficker with trafficking. Because one of the problems that we have many times is that, particularly in sex trafficking, the person who's being trafficked doesn't believe that they're being trafficked. They just think that this is their boyfriend and they have to make money and all this kind of stuff, right? So that's what the Palermo Protocol is, and to get Canada fully in line with it would be that we have to get rid of the requirement in the criminal code for the person who's being trafficked to be living in fear. So that's the technical part of it. But just off the top of my head, the ability to leave their place of work, and go find another job, that's one of the things. Are they getting their own money? Like, if they're making money, does it go into their own bank account? That's another identifier. Do they have access to their own ID? That's another identifier. So, like, if they don't have access to their own ID, if the money that they're generating isn't going into their bank account, and if they aren't able to leave and go find another job, there's 2 more things as well. I just can't remember off the top of my head, but then you can identify from the outside that person's being trafficked. You just have to prove all those 5 things, right? Because that's one of the challenges that we have with combating human trafficking, is that if somebody has drugs on them, we don't have to prove that they're drugs. We just say, hey, they have drugs on them, and it's illegal to have that, so you can charge them with it. Whereas a human trafficking case, we have to prove that the person that they're trafficking is not just their girlfriend, but is actually their trafficking victim. And that's always a challenge right here in Canada. So to fully bring us in line with the Palermo Protocol, I think would be a great benefit to Canada.
Wow, but it sounds very difficult. Well, I mean, I guess part of it is what would that look like to be able to identify a scenario like that? Because unless you have some kind of inside information, you see a guy, you see a girl, and they look, like you said, they look like they're together. But you wouldn't know she doesn't have access to her ID, or that the money isn't going into her account, and things like that. And it almost seems very difficult to be able to identify.
Yeah, it is difficult to identify, but so what ends up happening often is the police do police checks on these trafficking. They suspect that there's a girl that she's in a hotel room, and she seems to spend a lot of time there, but and she's prostituting herself. Now, the police will kind of monitor that, and they'll notice that she goes and every night she delivers money to an ATM machine, right? Okay, well, that's kind of interesting. When they ask her for her ID, she doesn't have any ID, right? Like, how do you check into, so she's staying in a hotel, but she doesn't have any ID. They can ask her if she has any money, and she doesn't have any money, right? Where's your bank card, right? I don't have a bank card, that kind of stuff, right? So, but they know, they can prove that she's depositing money every night into an ATM machine, right? So you're right. It takes a bunch of effort, no doubt. But to this point, we do all of those things the only thing that in Canada that we're missing about it is just that the police also have to prove that she's living in fear and that she believes she's being trafficked. The moment that she says that she believes that she's being trafficked, they can make the case. But up until the moment, if she doesn't believe she's being trafficked, even though she doesn't have any ID, the money isn't going into her bank account, and she can't leave. But because she's not living in fear and is not asking the police to help her, they can't prosecute the trafficker.
Yeah, and I guess you know what. Now that you say that, I think in my mind, a lot of times it just takes as a friend or a family member who knows the person, and they find out where the person is, and sometimes it just takes someone to say, "Hey, look, this is my cousin or my friend, and they've been missing for months. They're not coming home. Keep an eye out for them."
Yeah,
so they're on the radar.
Yeah, but the police will find them and say like, "Hey, your family's concerned about this," and stuff like that, and they say, "No, I'm doing fine. This is just my boyfriend. I'm just living here with my boyfriend." There's nothing the police can do about it, right? And so that's where and like, believe me, the traffickers know this as well, right? So the traffickers will train their traffic victims on exactly what to say and what not to say, right? It'll be a scripted message that they give when the police show up, just to ensure that the trafficker doesn't get arrested.
Yeah, and I guess like, I don't know, it's kind of weird because I guess for us is, you know, living in a first world country, and a very nice one at that. Even just like you know, that saying that Canadians are such nice people, and sometimes we think like, okay, yes, we can acknowledge that sex trafficking exists over there, overseas, in second world, third world countries, or even in the U.S. Like that's something that they do, and especially for people that live middle class. You know, it's just, you know, you have your nice, well manicured lawns and it's business as usual. It's like you don't see it, but of course it exists online. Clearly it exists online, but sometimes we just ignore it because we don't see it. We don't see prostitutes on our corners. And it's hard, I guess, for Canadians, that sometimes that we probably turn a blind eye to that.
Yeah, that's that is a reality. Although once you are aware of it, and so that's like we had the big win on last week there, passed the recognizing February 22nd as the Human Trafficking Awareness Day, and that's just an important thing so that once people are aware, you begin to notice it more, right? It is out of sight, but it's not that far out of sight, right? I always say human trafficking is happening within 10 blocks of where you live. Like, right? Keep your eyes peeled, and you will see it, and be aware of it. There's things you can do about it, right? If you suspect a case of human trafficking, contact the human trafficking hotline. There's a hotline here in Canada that you can call 24 hours a day. It's up and running, and you can say, "Hey, I suspect a case of human trafficking happening here," and the hotline will get in touch with local organizations that can do a spot check, can help a victim, all these kinds of things. Get the police involved if they need to be.
Yeah, it's funny now I think about it. You know, now that you say that, I do. It does come to my mind that I have friends who are no longer friends anymore, who were trafficking girls. And when it popped up in the news, and they're like, "Oh yeah, you know, this so and so, you know, he was you know, trafficking girls," and it was just one of those things, like sometimes you just don't assume the person would be up to that or whatever the case may be. But now that you mentioned, I'm like, yeah, I do have guys who I grew up with, who I used to hang out with, who grew up and started doing that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, actually, now I think about it,
they don't advertise that they're a human trafficker, right? Like,
well, it'd be like a pimp. I guess it would be. We just see it like, okay, yeah, he's just a pimp.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's yeah, and the like in the early 2000s that was cool, right? Like the word pimp was pimp my ride, right? It was a
Yeah,
TV
yeah, yeah.
show,
Or
right?
Big
Like
pimp
pimpin'.
juice or whatever the case may be. Yeah, that's right.
yeah, yeah, so that was like a cool thing, right? Like a gangster kind of thing. And yeah, but you never sat back for a moment and thought about it. Like what are they actually doing? And so that's what they're actually doing is called something called human trafficking, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would assume something like 95+% is not so voluntary of a relationship, with regards to like, I think on the MindGeek episode previously, we were talking about, you know, the if for a girl there may be a need for protection, and so there is a chance someone who's voluntarily in prostitution, I don't want to say doing it intentionally, but having a relationship to give them protection, and that's probably what most people think of with pimping, but as I mentioned, it's probably a lot closer to 95+% where it's not, that's not the case.
Hmm. Yeah, it's like I always say the human trafficking, anybody can fall victim to it. Traffickers just play on a vulnerability, and sometimes that vulnerability is not what you would typically think of as a vulnerability. So like a strong family structure, a conservative Christian family, that you would think, oh, that would be a hedge of protection. But in some case, that might actually be the vulnerability because the girl gets lured into the wrong crowd, does something that she's not proud of, and her trafficker will say, "Hey, I'll tell your friends and family what you're up to here, right? Like, unless you keep continue to do what I ask you to do, I'll let your friends and family know where you're at, or like I'm trafficking you right now, but if you don't continue to participate, I'll go get your sister, right? Your 14-year-old sister. We'll go recruit her, and we'll get her doing the same thing, right? And so those, while those seem like a protective measure or protective regime, a strong family, and that can actually be exploited by the traffickers. So the traffickers will exploit anything that they can. I've heard of a case in Montreal where it was a 12-year-old girl, upper middle class family, and her parents thought she was going to school every day, and meanwhile, for about 3 months, she was being sold for sex every day, right? And so that, yeah, and they just, yeah, her parents thought she was going to school, and she left at a school time and got home at a school time, but hadn't been in school for a few months. And it wasn't until the teachers said, hey, your daughter hasn't showed up at school for a couple months. They're like, what? So that's eventually how that one broke. But yeah, but it's yeah, so it's like this, there is no stereotypical story other than like they will find a vulnerability and exploit it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's actually a scenario that I'm somewhat familiar with. My wife was a foster mom to 4 teenage girls before we got married, working through a home essentially, and she would see essentially older men start trying to date these girls, and she could tell they were being groomed. And so that sort of grooming, and the reason, the vulnerability of being foster care, the lack of family support, I know you gave the example where they have the family support and they exploit that, right? But the other side of the spectrum as well. So as you said, they look for any opportunity. And I think the concept
they'll show up with fancy cars and shower them with gifts and buy them a condo building and all this kind of, or a condo and things like that. And then all of a sudden they'll turn on them and say, hey, I've got these massive debts because of you. Like, we got to go start making some money, right?
Yeah, and I think the concept of grooming really is what plays into what you said about those protocols, because the grooming is where they're not in fear because they've been groomed into this scenario that, they're not afraid, but they are sort of stuck and exploited.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, all of this discussion is like we talk about it in terms of human trafficking and the traffickers and things like that. But the traffickers are most, like, if you want to give them the most benefit of the doubt, I suppose you could say, are merely businessmen, right? Like, and that is the underlying issue that we need to address as a Canadian society, as a country. Is the fact is that there's a lot of money to be made trafficking girls for sex. And why is that, right? Because somebody is willing to spend money on that. And that's the demand side that we gotta address. And that's where the pornography thing comes back, right? Pornography is the marketing material for human trafficking. Pornography is how people get drawn in. Pornography builds an appetite, all of these kinds of things. And that's where we see, like, the demand for the sex trafficking just continues to increase around the Western world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure. So I think around 2016, Canada had changed its prostitution laws, and I know that around that time there was a documentary going around called Red Light, Green Light. They were sort of promoting the Nordic model. I know that we didn't quite pass that, but I wonder if you can speak to if you saw some of the change that caused, and what implications or what further change that you're looking to, that you think we can make, whether it be porn, prostitution, and things along those lines.
Yeah, so in 2013, actually, we passed the PSEPA law. It's a Protection of Communities and Exploited Persons Act, and that's it is essentially the Nordic model. So what it no longer criminalizes the girls, but it criminalizes the pimps and the johns, and the johns would be somebody that purchases sex. So it's been in place now for 8 years. What's very fascinating about it is that it took 4 or 5 years just to get police forces to start enforcing the law the way it is written, and so that's been an education piece that's we're struggling with. But it also we've also just seen that the demand has gone up continually, so that the police forces are just not able to keep up with the number of cases that there are. Like, the case number continues to go up. Now, part of that is because police forces are becoming more educated on what the law actually is, and they're starting to enforce it better. So you see more cases because of that. But the other thing is that there just seems to be, that's like public school. We had a survivor come and present before the bunch of parliamentarians about a year ago, and she was doing research around the prostitution, the connection between prostitution and pornography, and she was in Sweden, just at a high school there, and just having conversations with the high school students, and like secular atheist public high school, and she was just talking about like pornography and pornography use, and like one of the girls piped up and said, "Oh, like, I won't date a boy who looks at pornography," right? And she said that's kind of indicative of where they're at in Sweden. Like, they understand the connections between pornography and human trafficking and prostitution. And so my hope and dream is that we would get there here in Canada, get to that point where folks don't look at pornography because they don't want to contribute to the human trafficking, and they don't want to be a part of the demand and all these kinds of things. But
yes, wow. So what would be the impact on sex trafficking if prostitution was decriminalized?
Yeah, that's the decriminalized is the term that the left uses all the time. So the Liberals passed at their youth convention a couple of years back that they would
youth convention.
Yeah, they passed a resolution there that calling for Canada to decriminalize prostitution. I think this is a devastating trajectory to go down. We've seen places around the world have done that. So New Zealand, Germany, and a big chunk of Australia have gone this direction. Interestingly, it has caused an explosion in human trafficking in all of those areas. Germany, for example, Germany is kind of similar to Canada. Like, you have a social insurance number. There's like EI programs and workplace, like workers' rights that are enshrined in legislation. And so the big argument is that because this stuff was all driven underground, these workers had no rights. Now, what's interesting is after they legalized it, the argument is that all these people that were being prostituted would come forward and register, get a social insurance number, register for their EI benefits and all this kind of stuff. After they legalized it, a grand total of 7, like you can count on 2 hands, 7 people came forward and registered, right?
Wow.
And they went from an estimated 70,000 people being prostituted in the country to 700,000 people being prostituted in the country. While the arguments were all logical and kosher and they were soundly made, we're going to protect these people and all this kind of stuff, and we're going to give them all the benefits that every other worker has and all this kind of thing. The reality has not borne that out whatsoever, and in fact the problem has increased dramatically. Now, one of the things that outfits like Defend Dignity here in Canada, they're anti-exploitation group, what they do for shock value is they will publish one of these like legal German brothel menus, right? And that, like, if you want to get sick, that is something you read and you will get sick for sure. So that, just to prove the point that decriminalizing this does not end the exploitation.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously again, as you said, the kosher, with regards to the arguments, it all was proposed, and I think that's where the Nordic model, try to some extent, it doesn't go down the legalization, but it aims to avoid the criminalization of the individual who's being exploited, and I think for someone who's making the legalization argument, I'm guessing your responses, your challenges to them would sort of be, okay, well, how do we minimize exploitation if you're going to put forward this concept?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so like the argument always is like, well, what happens? What about the women that choose this? What about the women that choose this, right? And I say, well, I don't doubt that you will be able to find a case of a woman who has chosen to live a life in prostitution. I don't doubt that there are those women that exist. However, the vast majority of women that I have talked to and that have been interviewed and that the research has been done on that are living a life of prostitution have not chosen to be there, right? And so for the sake of the 90% of the women that do not choose to live in prostitution, I would make the case that we should not allow legalized prostitution, because it is inherently exploitive, even though you may be able to find a woman in the world that has chosen that life. I make the case that we make a bunch of things not for sale in this country, right? Our sexuality in my opinion, is one of those things that should not be for sale. My vote or your vote, for example, it is illegal to buy my vote. It's illegal to buy your vote. It's like somebody cannot come to you and offer you money so that you vote for them, right? That is something that is not for sale. Your kidney is not for sale in Canada. You may not sell your kidney, right? That is because we recognize the inherent exploitative nature of the fact that if people could go around buying kidneys, poor people would be without kidneys, right? That we recognize that causes an imbalance in the voluntariness of donating your kidneys. Is if you can just pay for one, well then wealthy people get kidneys and poor people don't, right? So we have laws around purchasing of organs. We also have a law in this country that says it is illegal to buy sex, and I'm ready to defend that, and I think that is because we recognize the exploitative nature that can come when people are put in a situation where they have no money, they need money, or somebody else can make a lot of money by selling sexual favors. So that's that. Like the whole like the Christian sexual ethic is long ways away from where we are. It's legal requirements in this country, but even if you take at face value what the legal requirements are, the whole conversation around our sexuality in Canada is around the whole idea of consent. Once you start throwing money into the middle of it all, the whole idea of consent gets a lot more murky.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty free market in nature, but I see what you're saying in that. I think the simplest way I'd almost rephrase what you said is the ability to perceive whether it was consensual or not becomes a lot more difficult when the numerical side could potentially skew that perspective, because you're exploiting someone's poverty to make that they feel like they don't have a choice.
Mm-hmm. So. Yeah, you have that for one, but like that like, so everybody wants to, particularly when they bring it into that, they want to bring it as just two parties and making a transaction, right? And even if we could grant that, that would be less exploitive. But the big problem that we have is that there's the third party, the pimp, right? And that is never considered in the whole argument, right? The fact that it's how do you distinguish between the
protective services?
yeah, exactly. Like how do you distinguish between one person who chooses to be there and the other person who's being forced there against her will by a pimp, right? That's and so given the overwhelming evidence that in the 90% women are not choosing to be there, we should fall on it, like, hey, it is illegal to buy sex in this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's definitely I lean a little bit more libertarian, and I would say that's an area where and I don't, to be honest, the term libertarian sometimes bothers me, and I tend to use voluntarism, and I think you sort of raise a really good point that this is an area where if you could protect the scenarios that are purely voluntary, and then when I made the comment about protective services, right? How do you decipher the pimp who's exploiting from the pimp who's paid as a protective service voluntarily, as opposed to the one who's hoarding the money and sharing a little bit with the person he's exploiting? I think it's a very good point that ensuring or protecting against the non-voluntary, it seems, at least at this point, to be wiser in our country to protect the 90% at the cost, in quotation marks, the cost of allowing the voluntary of 10% to continue. So I think, a question that I have sort of, maybe some of the listener, if they want to, whether it's get involved with this, the stuff that you're doing with regards to the laws here, what do you have any recommendations? Is it just, hey, write a letter to your counselor, reference this particular scenario? What would you say for someone who wants to get involved with, let's say, protecting the vulnerable or refining the porn laws to reduce exploitation? What would you recommend?
Well, the first thing I always say is just quit looking at porn, right? That would be a good start.
Yeah.
The second thing I say is donate some money to me. I always appreciate that. My campaign is always looking for some more money.
Yeah.
The third thing is get involved with a local organization that's fighting exploitation, whether it's an anti-pornography group or anti-human trafficking group. Every city, every town in this country has it's often like affiliated with the local church or something like that. Will have a group that's fighting pornography and sexual exploitation. Get involved with these groups. They're always looking for more talent and more ideas. And so, most of the provinces are starting like their own task force, human trafficking task force. Alberta, BC, Manitoba, Ontario, they all have one. So there's opportunities to get involved in that. If you live in a province that doesn't have a task force yet, advocate to your MLA to push for one. At the municipal level, if you want to get involved in politics, at the municipal level, work on making sure that like any public Wi-Fi, so at the swimming pool or the curling rink or whatever, if there's Wi-Fi make sure that porn isn't available on that Wi-Fi. The public library, for example, make sure that the public library is not helping feed people's porn addiction, right?
But you would figure that that those would be common sense stipulations that a lot of common Wi-Fi places would put up.
No, not at all. Like in fact, in Ottawa, there was big kerfuffles around. Some guy was like at the public facing, like one of the first computers at the library facing the door as everybody walked in, and he was looking at porn on the computer right there. And like these families were coming through the door. Yeah, and some mom was just like turn that shit off. And nope, this is my
That's
right.
Exactly
This is my right, right? And so and then the library got involved and was kind of like hot potato with the whole thing. And it was a big discussion, right? Like it seemed to me like, hey, this is a public place. If it's one thing to like do that in the privacy of your own home, but like you don't have to do that right here. So,
well, not to mention the law about exposing children to explicit images.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
So there's lots of areas to work on. And then there's the whole, just around like when I say like quit looking at porn and you chuckled, that's a pretty common reaction. But I know many church organizations are spending a lot of time helping people get out of their porn addiction. Like it's like when we say 85% of the population is using porn on a weekly basis, like that's the statistic, like, and that cuts across society, right? Like it's not just one segment of society, that's across society. So yeah, that's the challenge.
Yeah, no. Well, you're doing really great work. If people want to get in touch with you, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so you can visit my website. You just Google my name, Arnold Viersen. So it's ARNOLD, and Viersen is V as in Victor, IERSEN, and that should bring you to the Government of Canada's website. And from there, you can find my personal website. You can participate by printing off a petition there. We've got petitions supporting Senator Milda Shane's bill to ensure that children aren't getting access to pornography. It's called Bill S-203. I'm sure if you just Google that, at Bill S203. You'll probably get all kinds of information as well, and you should be able to find me through that too.
I'll put that in the show notes page. If I would love to pick your brain on something a little bit slightly off topic, but we had I don't know if you're familiar, Candace Malcolm. We had her on the show a little while back, and she was sort of talking. True North. She was talking about sort of the Wexit movement, and since you're sort of right in the heart of that, I know it's a total change of gears, but when she was talking about it, it sort of dumbfounded me that we hear about it right after the election, and it was sort of like, okay, yeah, just it's over. But she sounded like it was a little bit more substantial, and so someone there, I wonder, is that a fair assessment? If you could maybe give your 2 cents on that. Obviously, the pandemic probably paused all.
Yeah, no, that's like the Wexit movement is, or like Alberta separation is it doesn't ever go away, right? It's undercurrent that's existed here in Alberta. This whole idea that Alberta gets a raw deal from the rest of the country, equalization payments, Albertans in general are just like agitated around the way that they're treated by the country. This isn't something that particularly folks from Ontario, Quebec just don't understand, right? And I talk about this more often, where folks, if you're from Ontario and you're traveling the world and people say, well, where are you from? You'll say you're from Canada. If you're from Alberta and you're traveling the world and people ask you where you're from, you say you're from Alberta.
I'm assuming Quebec's probably similar.
I'm likely, but and so it's like the Alberta. We have an idea here called the Alberta Advantage. So we've typically been the lowest tax regime in the country and one of the more successful regimes in the country in terms of like proportionate GDP and things like that. And so there's just a frustration in Alberta around the fact that we've contributed outsized proportion contributions to the country, and yet zero recognition and seemingly like all of the things that we want to be doing continually getting shut down. So the real sticking point right now is the Keystone XL pipeline is been vetoed by the President of the United States, and the Prime Minister is nowhere to be found on it, right? And that's just like if it was aerospace jobs in Montreal that were being threatened by a decision by the American president, believe me, the Prime Minister would be going apoplectic over it, right? He would, the SNC-Lavalin scandal, right, where he's like defending 800 jobs in Quebec, and he like accidentally broke the law while he was doing that, right? He's like, well, I was just protecting the jobs, and meanwhile, Keystone XL is 8,000 jobs here in Alberta, and it's just like, there's nothing we can do about it, right? And that's
yes.
That's the frustration, right?
Yeah, right. Talking out of both sides of your mouth almost.
Yeah. Well, just the different treatment from one side of the country. So, and there's probably thousands of these things, right? Like going back generations. So there was a mill rate. If you ship something on the railway, there was a mill rate, and it was like 3 times as much for Albertans to ship their products to Ontario as it was for an Ontarian to ship their products to Alberta, right? And it was just like, well, why, right? Like, why does it have to be like that? And that was like a rate set by the government. And so like a guy that was building nails, like for building houses, nails for nailing wood together, he would be building nails here in Alberta, and he had to compete with nails that were being built in Ontario. And so if he wanted to ship his nails to Ontario to compete with them, it would cost him 3 times as much to ship it to Ontario as it cost them to ship theirs to Alberta, right? Effectively making it impossible for him to compete with them. And so it's just like things like that all the time, right? And the pipeline politics is probably currently the biggest issue, right? So the pipelines require federal approval, and we've watched the like Northern Gateway pipeline get canceled, the Energy East pipeline get canceled, the lack of concern around the Keystone XL pipeline, the Trans Mountain pipeline, like total boondoggle, and that when we're unable to ship our products, then it becomes a moot point to even produce the products, right?
Yeah, I mean the shipping rate thing sort of dumbfounds me. I mean, just thinking about it in this sort of like an economics or mathematics even perspective, you're like, well, it's not like you can have 3 times the shipment from one direction to the other, right? Like I don't know, it just sort of dumbfounds me, right? Like that everything that goes one direction's got to go back the other potentially. So, I could see a potential in difference in prices, but to be a 300% difference does seem very questionable and almost egregious.
Yeah, and then it's things like, so one of the latest ones that we've been trying to get the government to change on. So like there's an equalization idea in the Constitution. So it just says like the services that the government provides must be equal across the country, right? So that's an idea, right? But now what happens is that the average income in Alberta is almost twice as the average income in New Brunswick, for example, right? So, but because our income tax is collected federally, Alberta contributes a huge amount because it's a percentage income tax. So Alberta contributes a huge amount of income taxes, and then, but because the government has to like spread those, has to pay it equally out, it goes out of the federal government on a per capita basis, right? And so while there's lots of money comes out of Alberta, there's not necessarily lots of people in Alberta. So then a place like New Brunswick, where not a lot of money comes out, when the government goes to provide services, it has to spend the same amount per person in New Brunswick as it does in Alberta, and so we end up getting back a lot less than we pay out. Now, there's a called revenue stabilization program that the federal government operates, and so if your revenues drop dramatically as a province, the federal government will top it up. But then there's this like arbitrary cap at $60 per person is all that they will pay out of that program. And that just recently that's starting to like really hit Alberta, and the fact that like we've had some significant drops in our revenues here due to the price of oil and COVID economic downturns and things like that. So there's like, why is that cap on there, right? The only people that it's ever really affected is Alberta, right? And it's like, why did we have to have that cap on there, right? It's an arbitrary thing that happens, but yeah, then we get shafted out of $6 billion. Mm-hmm. So those are like,
does that come through like the equalization payments that we've always heard?
Yeah.
Like, I think it's something like Quebec's always been in the negative, like always getting a positive, and Alberta's always getting the basically negative on those equalization payments.
Yeah, so Alberta has received over the 200 years or 150 years since Confederation, Alberta has received 90 million. That's with an M, million, in terms of equalization payments, and has paid out like 600 billion, right? And Quebec over that same period of time has received 200 billion.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
So, I mean, as a sort of free market competition sort of oriented person,
yeah,
my thought is that some of the things that make, as you said, the economics of Alberta more competitive. You talked about having lower tax burdens, which drives more people to come there. It's made you more competitive, but then the province like Quebec, which has higher taxes, has their QST, which is again all these things that like make it less competitive. Here's a scenario where they're sort of undoing having different laws.
Yeah, well, and what's so frustrating, like another thing that's so frustrating about it is a lot of the like angst in Alberta is around the fact that like, hey, we develop our natural resources. We drill for oil. We're cleaning up the oil sands and all this kind of stuff. The oil sands, by the way, is nature's largest oil spill, right? So we're cleaning that up. But we're developing all that. Now, they have a moratorium on drilling in Quebec. Like, they've got energy there, right? But they have a moratorium on drilling there. Same with New Brunswick, same with Nova Scotia, just a moratorium on drilling. And so we pay out all this equalization, which goes to fund their social programs, right? And so, but they have them, so while they condemn us for developing our oil patch, they have their own oil patch, which they aren't producing, but they're happy to take the money from our oil patch, right? Like you see what I mean? It's like they have this moral superiority about how Alberta is developing the oil patch to the detriment of the environment, which also isn't true. But they keep on spouting this, right? And so they put moratoriums on drilling because, lo and behold, if you drill the hole in the ground, but then are happy to take the money that we get here in Alberta for drilling holes in the ground, right? Like that's what's so galling about it. So, like you didn't, like, fine, if you don't want to drill holes in the ground, don't drill holes in the ground, but don't take the money that we get from drilling holes in the ground, right? So,
yeah, no, it's fascinating because even for us as Ontarians, it's just one of those things that we're not familiar with because it's it's just not something.
But yeah, it's very connected because, for example, currently Newfoundland is experiencing this like rash of bankruptcies, personal bankruptcies. And why is that? Well, because like the Alberta economy is suffering, and all of the guys that fly out from Newfoundland to Alberta to work in the oil patch, they're not doing that right now. Right?
Interesting.
So,
there's a lot of seasonal sort of like workers, right? Like they would come. Seasonal might not be the right word. Yeah, they're
rotational. Yeah, so it's like a 2 weeks on, 1 week off. That's a very common. 2010. So it's 20 days on, 10 days off. That's very common. Oil patch job rotation.
Mm-hmm. And then they'll fly home even potentially.
Oh yeah, 100% they'll fly home. Yeah, that's like I fly out of Ottawa and I sit on the airplane with lots of guys that are flying in and out. Currently not. There's not a lot of flying happening at all. But like when I first got elected, it was the plane would often be probably half full of New Brunswick and Newfoundland guys flying into Alberta working in the oil patch, right? And interestingly, they all pay income tax where they live, right? So that's also hard on their like provincial budgets as well because they're not working in Alberta right now. But yeah, like a place like Sault Ste. Marie, they got the big steel mills there. They got two big companies up there. One of them is called Tenaris, and they build pipe. And 85% of their product ends up in Grand Prairie, Alberta. Right, 1,100 people in Sault Ste. Marie work for that company.
Mm-hmm. Which sort of speaks even more to the cavalier sort of, well, I guess Keystone Pipeline. It's the consequences are much more significant than the response sort of warrants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's just it's so that, and all of this drives the separation movement, right? It's like we pay $20 billion a year to the rest of the country just to get kicked in the teeth whenever it, right? Like that's
how it's perceived, right? So
yeah. It's like there's no thanks. It's like, oh yeah, thanks for carrying the country, right? Like, no, it's like, I know you guys like making money in Alberta here, but like we're just gonna we'll just put a straitjacket on you so you can't really do anything, right? Like,
yeah, when you put it like that, it makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So
for us ignorant Ontarian folk.
it's not so much like, and that's the hardest part to explain to Albertans, right? Like Albertans are convinced that Ontario just hates Alberta, And it's like, no, guys, they just don't care, right? Like,
and like it's out of sight, out of mind. We don't get it.
Yeah.
Right? Like it's a little bit more like most people have no concept of the like, the transfer payments and any of that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's like they're all just living their lives. They just go to the gas station and put fuel in their tank. They don't think about where it came from, right? Like,
we don't.
We're too busy. We're too busy going to Drake concerts or Raptor games.
Oh, yeah.
And we don't care if Trudeau gets the oil from Saudi Arabia, like,
Yeah, Venezuela. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah.
anyways, I really appreciate your time today. I think you already gave the listener, contact information. Is there anything you want to leave the listeners with before we wrap up?
Well, stay engaged. I get the impression your audience might be a more Christian audience. And we talked a little bit about the separation of church and state and that whole concept. I think that's important for folks to consider and understand that the church, as like the body of Christ, has a role to play in civil society and to get involved and make a difference.
Well, we really appreciate your time. And also what you're doing in Alberta. And thank you for coming on.
Anytime, guys. Thanks so much.
Yeah, so we appreciate your 2 cents. Obviously, you're adding it to my 2 cents, Darnell's 2 cents.
6 cents makes change.
But you heard me? Does that make sense?